Thank you very much, Christian. And I'd actually like to just say that I thought the previous speeches, both the previous speaker and all the speeches today have been actually amazing. And I would just like to begin by apologising for in advance, in fact, for the standard of this speech, which is not going to live up to them. And very occasionally, you're going to see me do something along these lines. I'm going to go, because I don't read actually my own handwriting all that well, and this is not a typed speech. But I just hope to offer a few ideas on how we may collaborate with the state and on why we ought to do it. But just to begin with, I may challenge Christian's idea that I'm necessarily a minarchist. Just to sort of illustrate, before I sort of get down to kind of grim and dirty kind of policy detail, where I'm coming from. I put up here, you'll notice that up at this top, that I'm representing as utopia here, I haven't put minarchy or minarchism. I put up anarchy and civil society. For the sort of more conservative types, you might be wanting to know what the idea of utopia might look like. Obviously, it doesn't really sort of say what the houses are going to look like, or what the roads are going to be, or how we're going to travel. But those are the names I put up there. I guess the only other element of this was just to illustrate that we're not just at war with, well, not so much at war. We do not fight in the same way, but we're not just opposed to totalitarianism. There is something else that we do have to keep in mind that is also the enemy of liberty, and that is just simple pure chaos, which I put on the same level as totalitarianism. I'm not sure if that's, in hindsight, I'm not sure if that was quite the right idea, because I think actually totalitarianism can lead to rather worse things than simple chaos. But having said that, we do know what sort of humans live like in a kind of pre-social situation before we kind of have any sense of liberty or of rights or of what is right and what is virtue. And we know from sort of the study of very primitive societies, from anthropology, that it's not a great situation. In fact, I happen to sort of agree with, I suppose, the Hobbesian idea of what it's kind of like. I believe a statistic I've heard is that in kind of primitive hunter-gatherer societies, without any more than just personal property rights, you end up with a kind of I think a mortality rate in sort of violent murder or conflict at about 30%. So in other words, nearly a third of people are going to die via somebody else's hands. It's rather tough. Obviously, totalitarianism can end up being a lot worse than that. But that's a pretty bad starting point. And I guess the other part of this is that I'm just suggesting that when we're moving, if you consider this like the playing field, kind of state of play in a political system, you might have a direction in which you're moving up on this triangle, which might be going upwards, but might either temporarily or perhaps worryingly more permanently be going in the direction of taxes at the same time. In other words, you may end up introducing some sort of state institution where before there was near chaos. As maybe an indirect consequence, you may end up moving more towards civil society, or more towards a kind of free a situation where freedom is respected. And I'm going to suggest that sometimes those sort of moves might not be the worst things that might happen. Okay, also, I do have just a couple of points to just begin in addressing the previous speaker. I know that, obviously we're, the question is, are we to suck with the devil, with the state? And I'd just like to begin by saying that we're not dealing with the devil to begin with. We're dealing with socialists. Well, at least we were. Now it's a little bit more difficult. But socialists, okay, now I'm not necessarily questioning their evil actions. I may occasionally wonder if their intentions are quite as evil as they honestly seem to produce when they're working so hard. But I would say that unlike the devil, they do not have a sort of supernatural power over us. We can sit down to dinner with them, and they're not always going to get the better of us. They may very well, they have often in the past, but perhaps if we look at their techniques, we may be able to work with them, and in so doing, increase our ability to promote freedom. Unlike with the devil, where you really aren't going to have that much hope, you're just better off leaving them alone. I suppose, yeah, and just a couple of points that emerged. You cannot jump from an unfree to a free society. And then there's also the question of, can we envision a modern stateless society? And I was just thinking, that sounds almost like, that sounds rather like a criticism of our system, that we can't imagine exactly what it's going to produce in advance. But of course, that is the major benefit of our system, that we don't imagine what's going to happen in advance. What we tend to do instead is document how wonderful things have happened up until now. On the basis of the various principles that we've operated. I think I'm actually stealing an idea that I heard last year from Stefan in the front row. It's actually, I'm using this in the case of education. I'm going to move into it a little bit later, but this is more or less what I've said. This is the main lesson of allowing the freedom to choose. What is a school meant to look like if you let there be choice? In fact, that is exactly what it will not look like. Planned or predicted in advance by policymakers. Instead, teachers and educationalists advance different forms of schools, and parents evaluate the results by choosing between them. Now, of course, in this book I've written, just out this month. I've taken a very conservative position, for one thing, saying that you can't imagine what the schools would look like. I mean, of course, in a case of true liberty, we don't even imagine whether there might be schools or some other method of delivering education. But the principle is in here, and I think that it's important to challenge that just because we can't offer, a kind of utopia as sort of, the socialists would like to, as communists would, just because we can't necessarily agree on one, or even necessarily produce several that a majority can agree with, doesn't mean that we haven't got some great ideas. And in fact, that might be the strength of those ideas. We don't know where they can take us, but we have an excellent track record. I suppose actually the beginning of my argument actually more or less comes at the end of Stefan's argument, in that I've started by looking at our attitude to the state. Actually, if I just bring this down to the side, essentially, we are currently in a position in which we have to comply with an awful lot of laws which we know they lack legitimacy. We pay taxes when we have to. We do not openly or break laws made by the state, even if they are not produced in a particularly just way. For example, if it drug prohibitions, we will not sort of be openly trading and taking drugs, except perhaps amongst friends and kind of in private spaces. We must do quite a lot to conform. At the same time, we go rather further than this sometimes. In fact, I imagine an awful lot of us do. Perhaps almost a show of hands over the best thing. If we are a victim of crime, this might actually depend partly on the various countries we're aiming from, but do we inform the police? Show of hands? Do we inform the police? If we were a victim of crime, theft, there's a couple of hands going up. Oh, I think there's in total, there's quite a few popping up there. Yeah, not a majority though, I'm amazed. And I suppose if you kind of were sort of minimally of the belief that a court kind of did have some concern for evidence, maybe you used a jury, or maybe you were relatively sure that the judge was not sort of completely just about to hang whoever the local political official was demanding. Would people be willing to testify in court? Perhaps if they were a victim? Oh no. Okay, that's one from the back. There's quite a few hands going up. Yeah. So there's a legitimate argument here. But what I'm going to suggest is that, just because, I'm not going to suggest that you can't be an anarchist just because you're going to stand up in a court whose rules are based on what a state has decided at some point. There's nothing inconsistent about that, but we have to accept that just complying with the state and even using the state's basic services now and then does not necessarily lend it legitimacy. Now, I'm going to suggest that we can go further than that, and that we can actually use the state to change society as well, or rather we can try and adapt how the state is behaving by collaborating with its officials now and then. And of course, this is a very dangerous technique, but I feel that in some cases this is our best hope for producing a society that offers more liberty. My case is that okay, we can make use of our ideas as a tool. We are, essentially, socialists will tend to sort of say, well, okay, they've got a certain set of mechanisms and they've got a certain set of ends that they want to produce, namely equality or some such definition or some kind of pattern distribution. And the thing is, they are incredibly bad at it. They ruin it every time, and they can only really hold on to power if they manage to also sort of nobble the democratic system, such that they can't get re-elected, or they can't get unelected. Every now and then, of course, some people are kind of signed up to socialism permanently, but every now and then you get a government in which is not completely signed up to the system. But finds it incredibly difficult to make any changes because, of course, there's a natural tendency towards taxes, towards greater government as the solution. Now, this is really our point where we can get in there. In some cases, we can develop policy mechanisms that are able to imitate the principles that we operate on. They assume the existence of the state. We have to accept that at this particular moment. Not forever. It's not a limitless acceptance. But we can reform state services in such a way that they will offer a better, they will offer simply a better service to the people that are forced to use it. And I'll just go into my example. I've for the last 18 months or so been studying the education policy in the UK, and I've been comparing it with a new mechanism that's been introduced in Sweden. That was the original introduction was in 1992, and it introduced a system of school choice, whereby various independent providers were permitted to accept state funding to run a school with an equal, would receive equal state funding from the state, and they would be paid on the basis of the number of students that chose to attend. This was an important principle that, the key features here was that there was just a general principle, a general law which allowed anyone who passed certain basic minimum standards to open up a school and to receive students. And the other part was there was no guarantee that they were going to receive students. They just had to attract them themselves, and if they did not, obviously they would have to close down. And other than that, they could operate in various ways. They could operate as sort of teacher cooperatives in the form of they could be based around churches. They could use private enterprise. They could be for profit. They can be for profit as well, which was quite a radical reform that was offered in Sweden. Now, the reason why I made the case for introducing it in the UK is that if we take a look at the way the education system is right now, we have compulsory education for children aged 5 to 16, and in a few years' time that's going to be extended up to the age of 18. So essentially people will not be allowed to enter the labour market in England until they are aged 18. And must be in some form of education, which is obviously a tremendous infringement on liberties. Of course, 90% of children attend state schools. The rest will take a combination of homeschooling, which is still permitted in the UK, and also attending the independent sector. The system is dysfunctional in a number of ways. And I suppose the main point is that how effective the education system is that it is highly reliant on the social background of the children that are attending. Children with high income, who have educated parents, tend to sort of muddle through. This is whether their parents decide to send their children to an independent school and thereby get a relatively good standard of education, or kind of use their nous, use their intellectual abilities to kind of navigate the state system, or just bully schools into providing more resources for their charming little girls and boys that deserve the best education that they can get. These families are quite aware of that. Whereas children from poorer backgrounds are very much shortchanged. Of course, there are many ways that the state system is defective. But one area that we looked at, which I thought was particularly enlightening, is that you get I suppose it's back to the 60s again, where in some sense the British educational establishment gave up teaching children the letters of the alphabet in English. They decided instead that for a number of reasons they relied on some amazing thinkers like Piaget and Vygotsky, a Soviet psychologist, who decided that education was purely he was a social constructivist who decided that all education had no objective value, it rather had a value within communities, and therefore that education was a purely communal activity. When this sort of got translated down into the sort of education policy in the UK, and I think this was applied in America and has been a problem in Australia as well, they decided that it was somehow authoritarian to teach the letters of the alphabet and teach the associated sounds and how you combine them into words. They thought that was stifling the creativity or the creativity of the child. I don't know how on earth this. I mean, it's quite clearly almost absurd prima facie. But because this was the doctrine that managed to be developed within the teaching colleges, and because the independent sector, the state at that time was developing a near monopoly on education, this thing went unchallenged, which meant that actually, oddly, it was when teachers were not very well trained, they tended to do rather a lot better at teaching children than those that had sort of swallowed the doctrine all the way through. So essentially they started teaching English a little bit like one might try teaching Chinese, with sort of thousands of figures. You learn some whole words which you're meant to recognize. And then eventually the idea is you pick up the underlying principles. But in the meantime you sort of used pictures. They had lots more pictures in the books, which was so it's fun for the kids, but not very good for getting to learn. They kind of had to guess. They looked at clues, so if they sort of thought they recognised an S, they were asked, what might the word be, that sort of thing. Rather than basically just teaching the language, this fairly useful language with 26 letters, a few more sounds than that, and some very easily grasped basic principles. I mean, it's just like any other Latin-based language, I suppose. So the result is that for several generations, if your parents did not teach you to read in the UK, and you were unlucky enough to have one of these teachers that was correctly trained in the dogma, you didn't learn to read. And as a consequence, despite the investment in education expanding massively over the years, we still have a large number of people who are functionally illiterate in that they can't read a poster. Or a newspaper and understand what the information inside it. And I think there is still a handful who are structurally illiterate as well, and they don't actually have any particular relationship with the written word at all. And this is despite around 50 years of compulsory education. So, I mean, as always happens, a near monopoly has created, in patches at least, a completely useless service that just wastes money and ruins people's lives, basically, because it stunts their potential academic and intellectual growth. We have a simple, as I said, we have a simple solution to this. We can, the main problem with this system is that the state sector, it's not so much that the state schools are allowed to operate, so much that they crowd out all the other all the other schools in the area, in that they are free. So if people are not really particularly keeping an eye on what the schools are up to, they're obviously going to send them to a state school. That just expands the use of the state sector until eventually the number of independent schools dwindles to the point that it's only those that really, the sort of upper middle classes for whom education is all, and are willing to sacrifice an awful lot for their children to get into these schools, that will use the sort of vanishingly small number of independent schools. Now, I suppose the simple solution here is that you just allow new people to enter the sector, and they are allowed to offer a free form of education as well. They get paid on the same basis as the state schools, and most importantly, the choice is left up to parents, and the schools are allowed to contract and expand in line with demand. No one's going to sort of get up and say, well, I'm sorry, the only places in the schools are now in these schools over here, you've got to go there. In this instance, it is perfectly possible for a school to open up and to expand and offer new places, or to open a new school in any area where there is demand. This is how we'd like to design the policy. Now, I mean, the advantage of this is that a voucher system can improve educational outcomes without challenging the principle of compulsory education. The disadvantage of this is that it improves educational outcomes without challenging the principle of compulsory education. Of course, this is where the problem is going to creep back in again. But I mean, I've read actually a perfectly legitimate critique of this, and saying, what if, okay, let's say we have a slave-owning society, you have, go back to the sort of the South in the US before the Civil War, and you have slave plantations. And people are noticing that these slave plantations are terrible. I mean, they treat slaves so terribly. And so a few people, radical anarchists are suggesting, well, why not make the slaves free? Give them rights like everybody else. What if some other person comes? I mean, that's totally rejected and doesn't fit with the ideology. So instead, somebody else comes along and says, well, you know what? We could set up a competitive system in slave plantations. We could say that slaves will have a choice of plantations to go to, and they can pick the best system, the best plantation in which they get treated the best, but they still have to go there. Not ideal, absolutely, obviously. Although I think that we might concede that education, at least in principle, is meant to improve the capacities of children, whereas obviously slave plantations would not. But I understand the argument that would say, well, why are you just adapting one system which is based on an illiberal principle of requiring children to attend some sort of educational institution that is being verified as a school or whatever by a state. And so I can understand that position, but at the same time, I think in the UK and I think in many other places, it is simply impossible right at this moment to challenge the ideology of a compulsory free education. So that is a major problem. So the question is, how are we to... the question is, what do we... how should we behave in this situation where we have the possibility we can either engage with a system that is profoundly illiberal, profoundly destructive to individual liberty. What is going to be our way of dealing with it? Now, we can either kind of withdraw completely and just say that the system is unjust, and just carry on, and maybe perhaps hope that one day the situation will change such that our views will become acceptable. But in the meantime, we still have lots of people having their lives ruined by state education, by this sort of near monopoly. And these people are also, I suppose there's sort of the left often talk about things like positional goods, of which education is certainly one, in that it affects where people get to go in society. And of course, meanwhile, you're going to get young people coming out of this terrible education system who will not actually have the capacities to understand even the very basics of what we're talking about here. And that might have long-term effects. Whereas if you teach children to read, then although they'll start off by reading the ordinary socialist propaganda, they'll not be hearing anything but the basic propaganda if they're not taught to read. And so I feel there's a consequentialist argument here, and that essentially, if we allow such a situation to continue without challenging the way the system works, we're going to end up creating exactly what socialist policies purport to prevent. We're going to create a very class-based society, at least in the UK, and I'm sure that there are a variation on the problems that this causes elsewhere, that will develop to a point where you will only get a good education if your parents have a good education and if they have money. And so without some kind of reform, you're going to just see a greater stratification of society, which in turn will allow socialists to come in and say, well, look, we told you so, this is what free market capitalism does, not noticing that, of course, it is in fact their policies that have exacerbated and created these divides. And of course, I believe that there are some people who've worked within government and work without, and have theorized, in fact, this is a good thing, that if you allow the society to break down, then you will simply, if you allow society to break down into these different class structures, and in fact you will, hasten the revolution. I fear that they could be right. They could make things so bad that their system looks better. And that's why I feel that we need to challenge them at every level. We need to challenge them at the theoretical level, and we need to challenge them at the state level. We need to challenge them at the level of policy as well, and that is why I feel we need to work with these people occasionally, and we should collaborate with the state. Thank you very much.